There is a man in a castle made of ice, alone on a mountain, surrounded by penguins, crying into the dark. He does not know why he is crying, not really. He just knows there is a feeling somewhere beneath the cold and the magic and the 1,000 years of forgetting, a warmth that used to belong to him. He cannot name it anymore, he cannot reach it. But sometimes, at night, when the ice groans and the wind dies low and the penguins are all still, he finds himself saying a name that feels like it belonged to someone else. Princess. He does not know who he is calling for. He never does. And that, right there, that single word drifting out over a frozen kingdom that should never have existed, is where one of the most quietly devastating stories in all of animation begins. Not with a villain, not with a hero, much with a man who used to be something else entirely, standing at the edge of a transformation so complete and so terrible that most people who meet him have no idea anything was ever lost. This is the full story of the Ice King, and more truthfully, it is the full story of Simon Petrikov, the antiquarian, the professor, the man who put on a magical crown to make the woman he loved laugh and never really came back. Get comfortable. Let the cold in. We have a long, long way to go. Section 1. The World Before the Crown. Who was Simon Petrikov? Before he was the Ice King, before the blue skin and the white beard and the empty eyes that had forgotten everything they once loved, there was a man named Simon Petrikov. And Simon Petrikov was, by all accounts, genuinely good. Not in a dramatic mythological way, not in the way heroes and stories are good, where their virtue is forged by hardship and tested by darkness and announced to the world at every opportunity. Simon was good in the quiet, ordinary way that real people sometimes are, curious about the world, devoted to the people he loved, a little awkward in social situations, enthusiastic about things most people found boring, and possessed of exactly the kind of warm-hearted optimism that makes a person wonderful to be around and deeply vulnerable to the specific kind of suffering that waits for them later. He was an antiquarian, a specialist in ancient artifacts, someone who spent his days studying objects that most of the world had forgotten, reading the stories locked inside things that were old when civilization was young. He was also, by the time we piece together the scattered fragments of his past, a professor of archaeology, the kind of academic who gave presentations about expeditions to remote mountain ranges and got laughed at by colleagues who thought the whole thing was a bit much. He went searching for legendary artifacts in places like the Hindu Kush. He found the Enchiridion, the ancient book of heroes, in an expedition that earned him a newspaper headline reading, with stunning journalistic generosity, Simon Petrikov unearths ancient treasure. And then, in the subheading with considerably less generosity, Silly man returns from expedition with a marginally exciting discovery. That tells you something about Simon. He was the kind of person who got small print headlines, who was right about things the world was not ready to believe, who kept going anyway, kept searching, kept believing that the old and the hidden and the strange had something to offer, that the past contained truths the present had simply misplaced. He wore glasses, round, slightly bookish ones that sat on his face like a small announcement that he was a person who spent a lot of time reading things. He had olive skin and dark hair and the general appearance of someone who looked better in well-worn academic clothes than he ever would in anything fashionable. He was not a large man, not physically imposing in any way. What he was warm, deeply constitutionally warm in the way that some people simply are. Not because life has been easy, but because warmth was the choice they kept making regardless. He was engaged to a woman named Betty Groff. Let us spend some time with this. Because it matters enormously. Betty Groff is not a minor detail in the story of Simon Petrikov. She is in many ways the central fact of his entire existence, the one thing that every other thing in his long, strange, catastrophic life keeps circling back to, keeps reaching for, keeps grieving without knowing what it is grieving. Betty was, in her own right, remarkable. She was a scientist and researcher, with a particular interest in the kind of arcane and supernatural phenomena that most of the academic world politely ignored. She and Simon, in other words, were made for each other from the first moment they met, which happened, as best we can reconstruct it, in a library. both of them reaching for the same book at the same time. Simon let her take it. She left a note inside for him, knowing he would come looking for it next. He later described it as the funniest, smartest note he had ever read. That is a remarkably specific piece of information to survive for over 1,000 years inside the memory of a man who forgot almost everything. That note, the funniest, smartest note. You can feel the weight of it, can't you? The way some moments become so saturated with the feeling of being alive and in the presence of exactly the right person that they press themselves into a person's core and stay there even when almost everything else has washed away. Betty, upon meeting Simon, canceled a planned expedition she had been preparing for months, a trip to the Australian outback that would have taken her far away and occupied the better part of a year. She canceled it to help Simon search for the Enchiridion instead. That is not a small thing. That is someone recognizing the shape of their life changing and choosing it willingly and throwing open the door. Their relationship deepened over the years that followed. They became engaged. Simon called her his princess, a term of endearment that would later be twisted by the crown's magic into something much darker and stranger. But in the context of their life together, it was simply what it was. A soft, private word between two people who were completely devoted to each other. Betty was Simon's entire world in the way that only the best relationships ever are. She was the person he was most himself around. The person he made jokes for, showed treasures to, came home to. What they had was real. Not fairy tale real, not the heightened, dramatic love of stories designed to make audiences weep. Just actual, genuine human love. The kind where two people have built something together, and it has become so woven into the fabric of both their lives that it cannot easily be separated from either of them. The kind that feels permanent, feels given, feels like the floor you stand on. Simon had no reason to suspect that any of it could be taken away. He had no reason to think that a small jeweled crown from a dock in northern Scandinavia would be the thing that ended it. He was, in this period of his life, 47 years old. He had his research, his fiancée, his academic work, his quiet fascination with the past. He was not a hero. He was not anything special in the way that words like special usually get used. He was just a man living a life that fit him well, loving a person who loved him back, and spending his professional hours in the happy pursuit of ancient things. He was exactly the kind of person the universe sometimes chooses for the most devastating stories. Because Simon Petrikov, without meaning to, without asking for it, without any warning whatsoever, was about to become the vessel for one of the oldest and most terrible curses in the history of an Earth that had already seen quite a lot of terrible things. He was about to find the crown, or perhaps more accurately, the crown which had been waiting for exactly the right moment for 65 million years, was about to find him. Before we follow Simon to Scandinavia, we need to go much further back. We need to go back to a world that predates everything Simon ever studied, ever touched, ever understood. Back to a world where humans had not yet drawn their first breath, where the continents wore different shapes, where the sky was filled with creatures that would later become myths. We need to understand the crown before we can understand what the crown did to him. Because the crown is not just a magical artifact. It is not just a source of ice powers and personality-erasing madness. It is something far more specific and far more tragic than that. Something that has been doing this same terrible thing to people for 65 million years, not out of malice, but out of a mistake that became permanent. And understanding that mistake is essential to understanding why everything that happens afterward happens the way it does. The crown was built with the best possible intentions. It was built to save the world. And it did not manage that. If you want to know where this story truly begins, not where Simon's story begins, but where the crown's story begins, which means where everything begins, you have to go back approximately 65 million years to a period Adventure Time calls the time of the elementals. Before the Mushroom War, before the collapse, before the land of Ooh even knew it was going to become Ooh. A time when the dominant, intelligent beings on Earth were not human, were not even humanoid in the way we understand it, but were instead ancient entities of pure elemental force. Beings made of ice, fire, candy, slime, each representing a fundamental principle of the world's composition. One of them was named Urgence Evergreen, and his story is the first chapter of a tragedy that would not finish playing out until 1,000 years after the apocalypse. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a perfect moment. Section 2. The Crown from the Cretaceous, Urgent's Evergreen, and the Origin of Everything. Urgent's Evergreen was the ice elemental, the representative of cold, of winter, of the kind of vast and patient power that can outlast almost anything. He looked in some ways remarkably like the Ice King would come to look. Pale blue skin, a long curved nose, wild white hair, a beard that suggested permanence and authority. But where the Ice King was stumbling and erratic and lost in his own magical fog, Evergreen was none of those things. Evergreen was sharp, had controlled, brilliant in the specific way of someone who has had 65 million years to develop a methodology and has done so with considerable rigor. He was also, it must be said, not particularly kind, not cruel in any dramatic sense, but the kind of person who treats those beneath him as instruments rather than individuals. His assistant, the small dinosaur creature he had taken under his wing, had in fact altered the brain of so that the creature could speak and think and serve him more efficiently, was called Gunther. Evergreen had stolen Gunther as an egg and raised him with the specific intention of having a capable assistant. What he had created inadvertently was something he never fully recognized, a being who loved him completely and would have done anything for even the smallest gesture of acknowledgement in return, had he never gave it. He gave Gunther orders and expectations and the particular corrosive attention of a mentor who sees a student primarily as an extension of their own work. He never taught Gunther a single spell. He never gave Gunther the kind of knowledge that would allow Gunther to act independently in a crisis. He kept Gunther useful and kept Gunther close and kept Gunther, in the most fundamental sense, dependent. And then, in the worst moment imaginable, he put Gunther in a position where independent action was the only thing that could save the world. And Gunther had nothing to draw on but the wish of his heart. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the comet. A comet was coming, not just any comet. This one was something different. Something that the other elementals described as a natural part of the cycle of things, a bringer of change and transformation, the kind of cosmic event that reshapes what exists rather than simply ending it. The other elementals, the candy elemental, the fire elemental, the slime elemental, accepted this with the philosophical equanimity of beings who had seen enough time pass to understand that endings contain beginnings, and that change, however catastrophic, is not the same as destruction. Evergreen could not accept this. His deepest wish, the thing that animated him above all else, was preservation, was stopping the comet, was preventing the extinction he could see coming with absolute certainty. He convened the elementals, presented his plan, and was met with refusal. They feared the wish magic he was proposing, but they understood in a way that Evergreen's urgency prevented him from properly hearing that wish magic of the magnitude he was describing carried enormous risk. That a crown capable of granting the deepest wish of its wearer was a crown that could not be controlled by anyone, could not be directed by anyone's intentions, could only respond to the most fundamental desire at the center of a person's being. And that desire, by definition, was not something you could guarantee in advance. They refused to help. Evergreen froze them in place, a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about who Evergreen was. He froze his colleagues, the other elemental beings who shared the world with him, because they disagreed with his plan. He was right about the danger, that he was genuinely trying to save life on Earth. And he was still, in this moment, doing something that represented a catastrophic failure of respect for the autonomy of others. He was removing their ability to choose because he had decided he knew best. The crown Evergreen built was a masterpiece of magical engineering. He forged it using the ruby eyes of an ancient lava beast called Magwood, a creature of immense power that he had to subdue in a battle that left the laboratory shaking. The phantasmal circuitry was elaborate, intricate, designed with one specific function: to read the deepest wish of the first being to bond with it, and to grant that wish with the full force of magic. His plan was simple. He would wear it. His deepest wish was the destruction of the comet. The crown would grant that wish, the comet would be stopped, life would continue. The plan was, in principle, not without elegance. What Evergreen failed to account for, what Evergreen could not account for, because it required understanding Gunther's inner life in a way he had never bothered to attempt, was that he would be incapacitated before he could put the crown on his own head. Magwood, despite losing his eyes, was not finished. He came back, blind and furious and terrible, and in the battle that followed, the laboratory was partially destroyed. Evergreen was pinned under rubble, alive but unable to reach the crown. The comet was approaching. Time was collapsing, and Gunther was standing there, the only being in the room who could act, holding the crown in small, scaled hands, waiting for instruction. Evergreen told him to put it on, to wish to stop the comet. Gunther put the crown on. And here is where 65 million years of catastrophe begins with a single, heartbreaking fact. Gunther's deepest wish was not to stop the comet. Gunther had never been taught to think in grand terms about the fate of the world. Gunther had been raised in the shadow of one person, shaped entirely by the relationship of an assistant to a master who never fully saw him. Gunther's deepest wish, the most fundamental desire at the center of his being, was to be like Evergreen, not to stop the comet, to be like the man who had raised him, who had given him the ability to think and speak and love without ever quite giving him the one thing he needed, which was to be seen and valued in return. The crown granted his wish. It turned Gunther into a miniature, insane version of Urgent's Evergreen. Blue skin, wild white hair, long nose, ice magic blasting from his hands, voice screaming a single phrase over and over in an endless loop that made no sense outside the context of Evergreen's relationship with his assistant. Gunther, no shio. It was the last thing Evergreen ever said to him repeatedly. The constant correction, the most characteristic expression of the mentor's relationship with the student. Stop, don't. You're doing it wrong. The crown, responding to the wish, recreated the version of Evergreen that lived inside Gunther's heart, which was not the magnificent ice elemental at the height of his powers, but a frantic, controlling figure always pointing out what shouldn't be done. Evergreen, still pinned under rubble, watched this happen. He tried to tell Gunther to use a spell to counteract the crown's effects, to fight through the transformation and focus on the comet. It was only in this moment that he realized, with the particular horror of a person arriving too late at an obvious truth, that he had never actually taught Gunther any spells. He had taken a being capable of learning, capable of growing, capable of extraordinary things, and kept them specifically in the position of assistant, never elevating them, never trusting them with the tools they would have needed to act independently. He called out the only spell name he could think of. Gunther, consumed by the crown's transformation, could not hear him. The comet hit the Earth. It hit with the force of what we would recognize as the event that ended the Cretaceous period, the Great Extinction, the ending of the Age of Dinosaurs. Of the moment when everything that had dominated the planet for 165 million years was wiped clean in fire and dust and the long, slow dying of a world winter that followed. Gunther was killed. Evergreen was killed. The other elementals, frozen by Evergreen's own hand, were killed. Everything was killed, or nearly so, and the crown survived. It lay in the aftermath of that catastrophe with its magical properties permanently set, permanently defined by what Gunther had wished for. Anyone who would bond with it, the first person to put it on their head when it was not currently bonded to another wearer, would be transformed. Transformed into the crown's version of Evergreen, the frantic, ice-blasting figure. They would lose their mind, gradually or quickly, to the same pattern Gunther had fallen into. They would call everyone around them by variations of a single name. They would experience the cold and the power and the particular madness of someone living inside a wish that was never meant for them. It survived the impact. It survived the ice age that followed. It survived 1,000 ice ages and the slow warming and the rise of new life, and eventually the rise of something like intelligence, and eventually the rise of something that called itself human. It passed through the hands of various people over the millennia. A boy named Sven, the first Santa Claus, which is a detail we will simply have to accept and move forward from. Each of them experiencing the crown's effects before eventually setting it aside or losing it or passing it on. And eventually, in northern Scandinavia, an old dock worker acquired it somehow and kept it among his belongings in the way that people sometimes keep old things they do not fully understand. Simon Petrikov was about to buy a crown that had been waiting for him in a very real sense for 65 million years. Neither of them knew that yet. Neither of them knew anything about what was coming. Only the crown knew, and the crown did not think about things the way the rest of us do. Section 3. The Purchase in Scandinavia, a joke that broke the world. Picture Simon Petrikov on a research trip. This is what he did. He traveled to unusual places in search of unusual things, followed obscure leads and cryptic references in old texts, and occasionally came home with artifacts that made his colleagues roll their eyes, and his fiancée ask enthusiastic questions. He was good at this work, not because he was physically brave or particularly adventurous in the action hero sense, but because he was genuinely interested, and genuine interest combined with academic rigor can take a person very far. The trip to northern Scandinavia was, from the outside, simply another research expedition. Perhaps he had a lead on the crown specifically, some reference in an old text, some trail of historical breadcrumbs that a sufficiently attentive reader could follow to a dock on a cold northern coast. Perhaps he came upon it more accidentally, the way researchers sometimes stumble over the thing they have been looking for without having known they were looking for it. But the exact circumstances of the acquisition are not entirely clear, but what we know is this. He found it in the possession of an old dock worker, recognized it as ancient and unusual and worth studying, and purchased it. He took it home. And then Simon Petrikov did something that, in the context of everything you now know about this crown, about its 65 million years of waiting, about the catastrophic wish magic permanently baked into its construction, is almost unbearably human. He put it on his head to make Betty laugh. That is the thing. That is the specific terrible thing. Not ambition, not greed, not some dark desire to acquire power or live forever or reshape the world. He put on an ancient crown of immense magical significance because he thought it would be funny, because he was showing it to the woman he loved. And the hat on the head gesture is one of the oldest and most universal gestures of gentle comedy. And he was a warm, silly, affectionate person who made jokes for the people he loved. He wanted to make Betty laugh. The crown bonded to him instantly. This is what it does, what it was built to do, what Evergreen's phantasmal circuitry engineered it to do from the very beginning. It reads the deepest wish of the first being to bond with it, and it begins, from that moment forward, to reshape the wearer toward whatever that wish requires. For Gunther, this happened in an explosion of immediate magical transformation. For Simon, it was slower, but because Simon was human, not because the crown had already been through many wearers and had perhaps developed something more like a process over the millennia, or perhaps because Simon's wish was more complex, more layered, more human than Gunther's had been. He blacked out. He had no memory of what happened while the crown was on his head. He came back to awareness to find himself standing there, the crown in his hand, and Betty looking at him with something in her face that was not laughter. What had happened during the blackout, as we learn much later from additional context and flashbacks, was that he had chased Betty through the city. He had shot ice bolts at the street around her. He had been screaming for his princess. "Where is my princess?" Looking for the person he called by that name, as the person whose loss the crown perhaps understood as the defining absence of the wish inside Simon's heart, because the crown had already begun to know him, had already begun to read the architecture of his longing. He did not remember any of it. He just saw the look on Betty's face. Simon Petrikov began recording himself on VHS tape. This is the detail that lives in the chest like a stone once you really understand it. He made video diaries. Because he knew, even then, even in those early days when the transformation had barely begun, and the crown's influence was still something he could feel as separate from himself, that he would not always be able to tell his own story. He knew the forgetting was coming. He could feel it on the edges of his mind like the first draft of cold air that signals a winter coming from very far away. But he made the tapes so that when he was no longer himself, there would still be a record. there would still be proof that Simon Petrikov had existed and had been someone. The recordings show his descent over time, his skin taking on a blue tint, not immediately but gradually, the way hypothermia works. Slowly, inexorably, the cold becoming part of him. His nose lengthening and growing pointed, his eyes going white, his hair fading and growing long. His body temperature dropping to around 30 degrees Celsius. Still alive somehow, but running cold in a way no human body should be able to sustain. He was turning into the Crown's version of Evergreen, just as Gunther had, just as every bonded wearer does. He was becoming the frantic, ice-blasting figure that lives inside the Crown's logic. He was also losing Betty. But the final tape, the last one he made as recognizably Simon, shows him in a state of profound grief. Not just for Betty's absence, but for the thing he was losing that was harder to name: himself. His own access to his own thoughts, his own ability to be sure that the voice in his head was his voice and not the Crown's. He talked about the visions, about the voices, about moments of complete loss where he would come back to consciousness and not know what he had done or said or felt in the preceding hours. He was watching himself disappear, and he was documenting it with the particular pain of a person who understands precisely what is happening to them and is powerless to prevent it. He said on the tape that he hoped one day to regain his sanity enough that Betty would come back to him. Betty never came back. Not in the way he meant, not in that lifetime. But Betty, as we will come to understand, never stopped trying to reach him either. The Crown protected Simon through what came next. Because what came next was the Mushroom War. The event that ended the world Simon had grown up in and began the long, slow process of becoming Ooh. The Crown, which had been designed to survive a catastrophe of planetary scale, kept Simon alive through the radiation and the chaos and the collapse of everything recognizable. Where other humans died, where cities fell and technology failed, and the great complicated architecture of modern civilization crumbled into rubble and ash, and the specific silence of a world that has been through something it cannot recover from, Simon endured. He endured cold. He endured frozen, blasted landscapes. But he endured the particular horror of an apocalypse that also happens to be consuming the last reliable pieces of the self you used to be. He walked out of the end of the world with blue skin and white eyes and a gradually disappearing mind, holding a crown that had destroyed him and was also the only reason he was still breathing. He walked out alone, or almost alone, because somewhere in the ruins of what used to be a city, there was a small girl crying in the street. Section 4. The Mushroom War and Simon's Survival. The Mushroom War is one of the most carefully implied catastrophes in all of animation. Adventure Time almost never shows it directly. It approaches it sideways, yet in flashbacks and photographs, and the occasional detail that lands like a quiet bomb in the middle of an otherwise ordinary-seeming moment. What we understand about it comes from fragments. A newspaper headline here, a ruined highway there, the particular shape of the craters, and the mutated creatures that populated the world in its aftermath. What we know is this. Something happened approximately 1,000 years before the events of the main series that was catastrophic enough to reshape the Earth. Nuclear in nature, anaklawayi, or nuclear adjacent, in the way of things that happen in a world already touched by magic. The mutagenic clouds that followed the initial destruction were not just radioactive in the conventional sense, but supernaturally mutagenic, capable of transforming living things into the strange and wonderful and terrible creatures that would eventually populate the land of Ooh. Candy people and slime people and fire people and all the rest. The show implies gently that these beings were not always what they are, that they came from something. The bombs fell, the cities burned, the sky went gray and stayed gray for a long time. In the early aftermath, the planet was a scarred and smoking place where nothing grew right, and the roads led nowhere because the places they used to connect no longer existed. The evidence of the old world was everywhere. You can see it in the ruins Simon and Marceline walk through, the signs and storefronts and highway markers half buried in dirt, yet the recognizable fragments of a civilization sitting inside a landscape that could no longer remember what they were for. Simon walked through this. He walked through the end of the world with a mind that was gradually failing, with powers he could not fully control, with a crown that kept him alive but took something in return for every day of that survival. The cold did not touch him, could not touch him anymore. His body temperature so far from normal that the winter air felt like nothing. He wandered the ruins, probably looking for something, without knowing what he was looking for. The crown's logic pulling him forward through a landscape that the old Simon would have found heartbreaking. And the new Simon was slowly losing the capacity to fully feel. He found food when he could. He found shelter where the ruins offered it. He kept moving because stopping felt dangerous in a way he could not articulate. The sense that if he stopped moving, the last remaining pieces of himself would have too much time to realize how alone they were. He sang sometimes. He had always been someone who sang. On the old VHS tapes, even in the darkest moments of his recorded confessions, there were moments of music. A tune hummed to fill the silence, a fragment of something cheerful attempted in a small act of defiance against the weight of what was happening. He sang to himself in the ruins of the Mushroom War, the way you sing when you are trying to remember what comfort feels like. He had his drumsticks. The flashback in Simon and Marcy shows him with drumsticks in his backpack, a detail so specific and so quietly sad that it stays with you. But in the absolute wreckage of everything, he had packed his drumsticks. The fact that there might not be a drum kit anywhere within walking distance was irrelevant. He was someone who played the drums, and he was not ready to stop being that person yet. He sang Cheers, the theme from the old American television show, Sometimes You Want to Go Where Everybody Knows Your Name. He sang it to himself and later to Marceline, this song about a bar where everyone knows you, a place of belonging, a place where you are recognized and welcomed and known. The specific choice of that particular song feels almost impossibly deliberate, whether the writers intended it as symbolic or not, because it describes everything Simon no longer had. A place, people who knew him, the experience of being known. The world he walked through had no place for him, and it barely had places anymore in any meaningful sense. The coordinates of his old life, his apartment, his university office, the library where he had met Betty, the streets they had walked together, all of it either destroyed outright or so transformed by the war's aftermath as to be unrecognizable. He was a man from a world that no longer existed, walking through the replacement world that had not yet decided what it was going to become. But the crown kept him alive. Whatever the crown was doing to him, and it was doing a great deal, peeling away his identity one layer at a time the way the cold peels feeling from exposed skin. It was also maintaining the basic functions of his existence with extraordinary efficiency. He did not get sick, despite the radiation. He did not die of exposure, despite the temperatures. That he did not starve, though he was often hungry, because somehow the cold kept his metabolism in a kind of suspended state that the old Simon would have found fascinating, and the emerging Ice King probably did not have the capacity to properly appreciate. He was a survivor, and probably, terrifyingly, in a world that had very little room for survivors of his type. He was 47 years old. He was aging strangely, not as a normal human would age, but not as an immortal either, not yet. Just suspended somehow, kept going by magic that did not care about his preferences, by a crown that had its own agenda regardless of what he wanted. He had his tapes, he had his drumsticks, he had the crown he could not take off without feeling himself begin to die. Because by this point, his body had adapted to the crown's magic so thoroughly that without it he was simply a very old man in a world that had ended. And somewhere in the ruins, a small girl was crying. The Mushroom War also needs to be understood in terms of what it did to the world afterward. Not just the immediate devastation, but the long transformation. The mutagenic clouds that followed the initial explosions began the process that would eventually produce the land of Ooh, that would eventually produce the Candy People and the various other elemental beings, and the strangely cheerful and functional civilization that would rise over the following 1,000 years in the aftermath of the collapse. In the immediate term, these clouds produced the mutants, creatures half-transformed, neither what they used to be, nor yet what they would become, lurching through the ruins with the particular horror of things caught mid-process. Simon and Marceline, in their travels together, would encounter many of these creatures. Simon would use the crown's power to protect her from them. Each time he used the crown, each time he let the ice magic out and leaned on the thing that was also eating him alive, he paid the price in fragments of himself. But the math was simple. Her safety or his mind, and he chose her safety every single time for as long as he was capable of making the choice. The Mushroom War's aftermath stretched for years, maybe decades. The exact timeline of Simon and Marceline's time together is hazy, partly because we see it in fragments, and partly because time moves strangely in a post-apocalyptic landscape when you are measuring it by survival rather than calendar. What is clear is that it was not days or weeks, but significant stretches of time. Long enough for something like a family to form between them. Long enough for Hambo to become Marceline's most prized possession. Long enough for Simon to write her a note she would carry for 1,000 years without fully understanding it. Long enough for him to know, with the specific lucidity that the crown still sometimes allowed him, that he was running out of time to be the person she needed him to be. Before we get to Marceline in full, we should sit with the picture of Simon in this period because he was remarkable in his own right, and in a way the show sometimes does not fully dwell on, but that deserves to be said plainly. Here was a man whose mind was being taken from him, whose identity was dissolving at the edges, who was living in the ruins of a world that had destroyed everything familiar and everyone he knew. And he was still trying to keep her safe, keep her fed, keep her spirits up, make her laugh in the way you do when you are terrified and in pain, but someone else is counting on you to be the adult. He was 47 years old. He had no one. He was becoming something he did not want to become. And he showed up for her anyway. That is the core of Simon Petrikov, stripped of all the later Ice King mythology. In the worst circumstances imaginable, he still showed up. He still chose kindness over despair. He still held on to enough of himself to recognize that a child alone in the ruins of the world needed someone to hold her teddy bear and tell her she was going to be okay. He was wrong about being able to stay with her forever. But he was right about her being okay. She was going to be okay. Section 5, Marcy. Just you and me in the wreckage of the world. She was standing in the street, crying. The exact age of young Marceline in this first encounter, the flashback at the very end of I Remember You, has been described as toddler-aged. Small enough that the pink, stuffed animal Simon found for her in the destroyed toy store was nearly as big as she was. Small enough that the word daddy was what she was calling into the empty street before Simon appeared. She had been separated from her own father. I was alone in the ruins, had none of the power or the century-hardened survival instincts that she would later develop. She was just a child who was very scared in a world that had just ended with no one coming for her. Simon found her. We do not know exactly how, whether he heard her crying from some distance and followed the sound, or whether he simply rounded a corner and nearly stumbled over her, or whether there was something of his still functional instincts as a decent human being that pulled him toward places where someone might need help. But he found her. And he did the thing that people do when a child is crying alone in a ruined street. He went to her. He talked to her. He found somewhere in the ruins of a destroyed toy store with a logo eerily similar to that of a certain famous toy chain. Us a pink stuffed bear. A toy that would later be named Hambo, that would later become one of the most important objects in two separate characters' lives, that would eventually be sold and recovered and sacrificed in a moment of profound friendship. And he gave it to her, and she stopped crying. Her name was Marceline. She called him Simon, eventually. He called her Marcy. And they began to travel together through the ruins of the world, two unlikely companions in the specific way that catastrophe sometimes creates family out of strangers. The image of them in those early days is both beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Simon was 47 years old, a man with blue-tinted skin and increasingly white hair who could blast ice from his hands but increasingly could not be sure what he was thinking in any given moment. But Marceline was a child of perhaps 4 or 5 or 6, half demon by parentage, already technically unable to eat regular food without discomfort, already beginning to discover her own strange nature without anyone around to explain it to her. They wandered the post-apocalyptic landscape together, looking for food, for shelter, for other people who might have survived. They found the food sometimes, canned things in the ruins of stores, occasionally still edible things in the rubble of what used to be restaurants and arms. They found shelter in the frames of destroyed buildings, in vehicles that still had their shells intact, in wherever the particular geometry of the wreckage created something like a roof. Simon kept her spirits up. This is worth emphasizing because it was not easy, and the effort it required was enormous. And he made it look like it was not enormous at all. He joked about dead rats being good traveling companions. He pretended VHS tapes were movies they could watch without electricity, holding them up and staring at them with exaggerated concentration before announcing the plot. He was funny in the gentle, warm, slightly dorky way that the best kind of adults are funny with children. Not trying too hard. Not performing for her, just being genuinely himself in a way that happened to be reassuring and sometimes silly. He sang to her, the Cheers theme song and other things, and probably original compositions in the way that caregivers improvise music for children who need comfort. He kept going in the particular act of radical optimism that is taking care of someone else's well-being when your own is in serious question. Thus, the Simon and Marcy episode follows them specifically when Marceline was 7 years old, a few years after their initial meeting, which means years into their wandering together. At this point, they were a functional unit in the way of people who have survived together for long enough to know each other's rhythms, each other's habits, each other's particular varieties of fear. Simon knew when Marceline was scared and how to address it. Marceline knew that Simon sometimes needed her to stop him from using the crown, and she did this. At one point hiding in a car and waiting for mutants to pass rather than letting Simon blast them, because she understood before Simon fully understood that every use of the crown cost him something he could not get back. That is remarkable. She was 7 years old in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and she was already protecting him the way he was protecting her. Already making the calculation that his mind was more important than her immediate safety. Already loving him in the complete and uncomplicated way that children love the adults who take care of them. A love that does not require the loved person to be perfect, that accommodates the blue skin and the occasionally alarming eyes, and the times he used a name that was not her name. He started calling her Gunther sometimes. Not often. Not yet. Not in those early years. But occasionally. The crown's influence surfacing in those unguarded moments, reaching for the name it already knew. Marceline noticed. In the Simon and Marcy episode, you can see her notice. She does not react with alarm. Much because she is 7, and she has already normalized a great deal of what most people would find extremely alarming. She just noted it. She knew, in the way that children sometimes know things they cannot articulate, that she was watching Simon slip away. And she could not stop it. Nobody could stop it. What Simon left her, in those years, beyond Hambo, beyond the songs, beyond the warmth of his care, was a note. Not given to her directly, not in any formal sense. Written on the back of a photograph, in the handwriting of a man who knew that his handwriting was one of the things that was going to disappear along with everything else about him. A note that Marceline would carry for 1,000 years, folded inside whatever she had that she kept close. And that she would eventually show to the Ice King without understanding until much too late that he would recognize neither the handwriting nor the words as having anything to do with him. The note said, "Marceline, is it just you and me in the wreckage of the world? The magic that keeps me alive is making me something I do not want to be. I do not know what I do when I am not myself. Please forgive me for whatever I do when I don't remember you." He wrote that note while he still knew her name, while he still knew his own name, while the part of him that was still Simon Petrikov had enough purchase on his own mind to understand the shape of what was coming and leave a record of it for her. Not the way he had made videotapes for himself, not to escape the forgetting, but to leave something behind for the people who would still be there after it happened. He was using the crown to protect her. Every time the mutants came, and they came often lumbering through the ruins with their half-transformed bodies and their unclear intentions, Simon pulled the cold up from whatever deep place it now lived in him and pushed them back. Ice walls, ice blasts, the Arctic fury of something that had stopped being fully human and had not yet decided what it was going to become instead. He was devastatingly effective. He was also paying for it in the only currency he had left. His grip on his own history, His grip on Betty's name, on his name, on the specific texture of who he had been before all of this. But there was one moment in Simon and Marcy that feels like it crystallizes the whole period. Simon, having used the crown to protect them from a particularly aggressive mutant, sits back down with Marceline in the shelter they had found for the night. The crown is off his head. He always took it off when he could, though the headaches that came with taking it off were getting worse. Marceline falls asleep leaning against him, and Simon sits there in the dark of the ruined world, watching her breathe, knowing that he loves her in the specific, terrifying way that parents love children, knowing also that this love has an expiration date determined not by his choices but by the crown's, and that there is nothing he can do about it except stay as long as he can and prepare her as well as possible for when he has to go. He had arranged, before the end, for someone to look after her. As the transformation deepened, as the moments of clarity grew shorter and the moments of the crown's voice grew longer, he made preparations. He told a young Marceline that she would always be fine even without him. He told her this while still recognizing her, while still being able to look at her face and know whose face it was. Eventually, he stopped being able to do that. Marceline later said she understood, that she knew he had to go, that the thing he was becoming was not a thing that should be around a child. She was right, and she was also being extraordinarily gracious about a wound that did not fully heal for 1,000 years, that she would still be carrying when she found the Ice King making a fool of himself at her door in the present-day land of Ooh, had calling her Gunther and asking if she would write a song with him. She knew who he was. She just could not make him know. And that gap, Yana, the 1,000 years of her knowing and his not knowing, of her carrying the memory and him carrying the absence of the memory, is one of the things that gives the Ice King's story its particular weight. It is not just that he lost his mind, it is that someone who loved him remembered exactly who he had been, carried that knowledge for a millennium, and could never reach him with it. The wreckage of the world was also the wreckage of a friendship that had been, for a few years, the most important relationship either of them had. And the note on the back of the photograph was the only bridge left between what he had been and what he became. He had asked her forgiveness in advance for everything the crown was going to make him do. She gave it. She never stopped giving it. That is what love looks like when it survives 1,000 years of forgetting. Section 6, The Long Forgetting. How Simon became the Ice King. The transformation did not happen all at once. That is important to understand. If the transformation had been sudden, if one day Simon Petrikov had been himself, and the next day he had been the Ice King, fully formed and fully amnesiac, it would have been a simpler story. Terrible, yes. Irreversible, yes, but simpler. What actually happened was worse because it was gradual. Because there were years between the man he had been and the thing he became where he was neither fully one nor the other, where he was Simon losing ground to the Ice King, fighting for every lucid moment, documenting the battle on tape, aware enough in his good periods to understand exactly what was happening and how it would end. The crown had a specific mechanism for this. Beyond the physical transformations, the blue skin, the pointed nose, the white hair and eyes, the beard that grew in like frost colonizing the landscape, there was a progressive rewriting of the self. The crown's phantasmal circuitry, built by Evergreen to bond completely with its first wearer, did not just grant wish power. It replaced. It rewrote. It took the particular person Simon Petrikov was, the scholar, the romantic, the warm and funny and slightly awkward professor who had loved Betty Groff and discovered the Enchiridion and made video diaries so he would not be forgotten. And it filed away those characteristics one at a time, replacing them with the template it had been programmed to produce. The Gunther Wish template, the frantic ice wizard, the being that was permanently frozen in the emotional logic of a dinosaur apprentice 65 million years ago who only wanted to be seen. The voices came first in the early days. Simon recorded this on tape. The voices, the visions, the sense that there were things in his head that were not his thoughts, that wanted things he did not want, that reached for the crown the way an addiction reaches for its substance. He fought them. He described fighting them explicitly on the tapes, in the moments of clarity that the early stages still allowed him. I fought with them, he says in the fragments we have. I shouted at them until I realized it wasn't real. It was the crown. That distinction, "It was the crown," shows up in the early recordings as a separating statement, a way of categorizing the experience as external to himself. As time passed, making that distinction became harder. The crown's thoughts began to feel more and more like his own thoughts. The crown's desires began to feel more and more like desires he had always had. The absence of Betty, which had been a wound in Simon's heart, became something the crown could reach into and transform, not healing it, not filling it, but redirecting it into something it could use. The obsession with finding a princess, the compulsion to find his princess, how to bring her home, to fill the specific shape of the absence Betty had left. The crown did not create the loneliness, it weaponized it. Simon had loved Betty more than he could easily put into words, and the crown took that love and ground it down into something the Ice King could still feel in some attenuated form. The pull toward a princess, any princess, the certainty that somewhere there was someone who would make the emptiness stop. The Ice King did not know he was looking for Betty. He did not know Betty had existed. But he was always, in some sense that never quite extinguished itself, looking for her. His memories went in layers. The most recent memories went first, in the typical fashion of the kind of forgetting the crown produced. The mushroom war years grew hazy, then vanished. Marceline became a face without a name, then a name without a face, then nothing at all. Betty became a word that felt important without his knowing why. His own name, Simon Petrikov, became the name of a stranger on an old videotape that he found embarrassing. By the time the world had settled into the early version of what would become the Land of Ooh, the transformation was essentially complete. The Ice King had no clear memory of the Mushroom War, no memory of Marceline, no memory of Betty in any explicit sense. He had powers over ice and cold that he could not fully explain, but accepted as simply his own. The way you accept your height or the color of your eyes. He had a castle that he had either built or found, depending on which period of the transformation we are talking about. He had a collection of penguins who seemed to accept him entirely, which is to say they had no basis of comparison, and therefore could not find him particularly unusual. He had the specific quality of loneliness that comes not from isolation alone, but from isolation plus the dim awareness that something is missing. Not enough awareness to identify what is missing, just enough to feel the absence, to reach for it in the middle of the night, to say princess into the dark without knowing who he is calling for. There were small, flickering moments over the centuries where something got through. Not often, not clearly. But the person inside the crown, the stored version of Simon that the phantasmal circuitry preserved, as we would learn much later, was never entirely gone. He was just locked away somewhere that was very hard to reach from the outside. The Ice King that walked around the Land of Ooh was, in most meaningful senses, not the same person as Simon Petrikov. He had Simon's face shaped differently by the crown's transformations. He had Simon's body, altered beyond recognition. He had the leftover archaeology of Simon's relationships, the pull toward Marceline that he could never explain, the feeling that Betty's name meant something without knowing what. But his personality, his memory, his sense of who he was and why, these belonged to the crown now. And yet, even in his fully transformed state, the Ice King retained certain things. He was fond of his penguins in the specific way Simon had been fond of everything that seemed to like him. He was, beneath the erratic behavior and the kidnapping and the tantrums, genuinely not cruel in his intentions, merely profoundly confused about what was acceptable and what was not, about the difference between what he wanted and what other people wanted, about the relationship between loneliness and love and the ethics of trying to address one with the other. He was funny, sometimes, with the slightly off timing of someone who was working from instincts they could not explain. He played the drums. He sang. He was the echo of Simon Petrikov trying to exist in a body the crown had repurposed. And sometimes the echo was almost loud enough to be heard. What was coming, over 1,000 years later, when the crown had been doing its work for so long that the Ice King had essentially forgotten what it was like to be anything other than what he was a Christmas special, a pair of videotapes, and a boy and a dog discovering a suitcase in a dump. The truth was going to come out, not to Simon, but to the world. To Finn and Jake, who had been fighting this strange old man for years without knowing the full weight of what they were fighting. to Princess Bubblegum, who had assessed him as a manageable nuisance, to Marceline, who had always known the truth but had never found a way to make it land. The truth was going to come out, and when it did, nothing was ever going to look the same again. Section 7. Holly. Jolly Secrets. The world learns the truth. Finn and Jake found the tapes by accident in the way that the best discoveries sometimes happen. Jake had dug up a buried suitcase from the dump, which raises its own small mystery about why the tapes were there. Whether Simon had buried them deliberately at some point, or whether they had ended up in the refuse of the land of Oo through some more inadvertent path, and had then, for reasons known only to Jake, buried the suitcase again without opening it. Finn recognized it as something he had seen the Ice King hiding. They dug it up, brought it home, and settled in to watch what they assumed would be a collection of embarrassing secrets. What they found instead was something considerably heavier than embarrassing secrets. The tapes begin as exactly what Finn and Jake expected: the Ice King's video diary. His mundane inner life documented with the specific combination of pathos and comedy that defined his character even before the full weight of his backstory was known. He talks to his diary like a confessor. He worries about his weight. He does penguin dance parties. He dresses up in a black wig and sings songs by Marceline in what feels like one of the small, strange ways the Crown-era Ice King processed memories he could not consciously access. He could not remember Marceline as a specific person from his past, but some pull toward her music, her presence, her voice still existed at a level below his conscious awareness. The early tapes are funny, genuinely funny, in the specific way of watching someone who does not know they are being observed. The Ice King at home, without the performative villainy, without the posturing. Just an old man in a big empty castle talking to a camera about how lonely he is and pretending that the camera understands. But then they get to the old tape, the one that is unmistakably different from the others in quality. While in the aging of the video, in the face on the screen, a man with olive skin and dark hair and round glasses, speaking in the clear, careful voice of someone who is choosing their words with great care, knowing that these words are going to have to do a lot of work. Hello, my name is Simon Petrikov. What Finn and Jake see on that final tape is the complete story, or as much of the story as Simon had managed to record before the transformation had gone too far for him to hold a camera. They see the crown. They see him putting it on to make Betty laugh. They see the physical changes beginning, the skin going bluer, the nose lengthening, the hair going white. They see his grief over Betty's departure, expressed in the uncertain way of someone who no longer has full access to the grief but can still feel its outline. Now, they see him beginning to talk about the voices, the visions, the sense of himself slipping away. And at the end of the tape, when they look over at the Ice King himself, who has been watching the tape alongside them, or rather whose presence has been tangled up in the watching of the tape throughout the episode, something extraordinary happens. Or rather, something fails to happen. The Ice King does not recognize himself. He watches Simon Petrikov on the tape the way you would watch a stranger confess to something you have no connection to. He is not unmoved. There is something in his expression during the watching that suggests some subterranean recognition, some vibration below the threshold of his conscious awareness. But when the tape ends and the emotional enormity of what they have all just seen comes down on the room, the Ice King's response is to look up with an expression of mild embarrassment and say, "Now you know my horrible secret. I used to wear glasses." It is one of the most quietly devastating comedic beats in the entire run of the show. Not because it is not funny. It is funny in the specific way that extremely sad things are sometimes also funny, but because of what it tells us about the completeness of the transformation. The Ice King does not know that Simon Petrikov is him. He watches a video of himself before the crown with the emotional distance of someone watching a documentary about a stranger. Betty is not someone he lost. The crown is not something that ruined him. The glasses are the embarrassing detail because the glasses are the only thing he can recognize as relevant. Finn and Jake, watching this, they do something they had not done very often up to that point. They cannot bring themselves to hate him. They cannot sustain the simple antagonism that had defined their relationship with the Ice King up to now. Because you cannot watch a man's tragedy and continue to experience him as just an obstacle. You cannot know what happened to Simon Petrikov and continue to see the Ice King as simply a comedic villain. This was the moment the show made its pivot, gently and without announcement. Not a dramatic proclamation, just a two-part holiday special that ended with Finn and Jake sitting in their house looking at each other, with the specific expression of people who have just been given a piece of information that they will never be able to put down. Princess Bubblegum, learning about this later, would develop a complicated relationship with the information as well. The scientist in her wanting to understand the crown's mechanisms. The moral architect of the Candy Kingdom processing what it meant to have been dealing with a victim all along without recognizing it. Marceline, when it became clear that Finn and Jake knew Simon's story, would eventually begin the slow process of letting her own history with him be known. Though she would not share it fully, not yet. Not until the episode that would break a lot of people's hearts in a way that was entirely worth being broken. The tapes were also the moment the audience's relationship with the Ice King changed permanently. Up to that point, he had been, as one character puts it, a nuisance, something between a villain and a comedy sketch. Irritating in his persistence, and occasionally dangerous, mostly just sad in the specific comedic way of someone whose dysfunction was played for laughs. After the tapes, he was still sometimes played for laughs, but underneath every laugh was the weight of Simon Petrikov in that final recording, watching himself transform and documenting it with careful sadness. You could never quite see the Ice King the same way again. And that was the point. That was always the point. Section 8, Betty's Return. Love Across 1,000 Years. The episode called Betty is one of the strangest and most emotional episodes in a series full of strange and emotional episodes. It begins with the specific scenario of what would happen if the crown's magic were drained away. Not destroyed, drained. An anti-magic wizard named Bella Noche arrives in the land of Oo and removes the magic from the wizards gathered in Wizard City, which includes, in a critical plot point, the Ice King's crown. Without the crown's magic, Simon Petrikov's body cannot sustain itself. He has been alive for over 1,000 years on the crown's power, his biology so thoroughly transformed and maintained by magic that the removal of that magic is essentially the removal of the thing keeping him alive. He begins to age rapidly, to collapse into the condition of a very old man who has actually been alive for over 1,000 years and whose body, without the crown to maintain the fiction of his continued existence, is suddenly aware of just how much time has passed. But the crown's magic being drained produces one other effect. Without the crown's influence suppressing his own identity, Simon Petrikov reasserts himself. The personality, the memories, the specific configuration of who he was before the crown. They come back in the space left by the magic's absence. He is Simon again. He looks younger than he should, having been physically preserved by the crown at something like his 47-year-old state, though the reversal of the magic leaves him aging rapidly toward the truth of his 1,000-year existence. He is dying, but he is himself. And in the time he has before that dying completes itself, he does the thing he has apparently always wanted to do if he ever got the chance. He finds the magical means to open a small portal, a window back through time, to the period just before Betty left him. He wants to reach through it and apologize. Yet he wants her to know that whatever he did while wearing the crown, it was not him. He wants to say the things the crown never let him say. Betty sees the portal open. She does not hesitate. Not for a second. She jumps through it. She arrives in the present-day land of Oo. A woman from 1,000 years in the past, in a world she does not recognize, with no preparation and no plan, and finds Simon dying. The reason Simon never saw her again after the crown's first incident was not simply that she ran. She ran, yes, but she ran into a time portal that delivered her straight to this moment, which means from her perspective she went from watching Simon put on the crown and chase her with ice bolts to standing in a future land of Oo watching Simon die on a strange street, with no time in between. She had one job to do. She figured out what the job was. She went and did it. In a sequence of considerable urgency and no small amount of extraordinary character establishment, Betty Groff, a woman from before the Mushroom War, a woman who has never encountered magic in its functional sense, a woman who has about 20 minutes before Simon dies, figures out how to defeat Bella Noche, restores the magic to the wizards, and saves Simon's life. The crown's magic comes back. Simon transforms back into the Ice King. His death is prevented. And Betty, who jumped through a time portal to save a man who no longer remembers her, who fought an anti-magic entity with resources she did not have and won, who sacrificed her entire past to be here at this exact moment, watches the Ice King look at her with blank eyes. He does not know her. Yet she knew this would happen. She must have understood, in the time she had to process what was happening around her, that restoring the crown's magic would restore the Ice King rather than Simon. She did it anyway because the alternative was Simon dying. She chose the Ice King over Simon's death, which is to say she chose his existence over her own reunion with him, which is to say she showed, in this first act in a world that was not her own, the specific quality of love that would define her for the rest of her time in Ooo. Love that was willing to pay the highest possible price with no certainty of return. She flew away on a magic carpet she had somehow acquired, because Betty Groff is exactly the kind of person who figures out how to acquire a magic carpet in the middle of an emergency. She told Simon she would find a cure. She would find a way to free him from the crown without killing him. She would fix it. She did not fix it. Not for a long time. Not without enormous cost to herself. But she tried, and the trying was extraordinary in its commitment and its scale. Betty spent years in Ooo working on the problem. She acquired the powers of Magic Man, a Martian wizard whose magical ability was matched only by his instability and grief, through an accident of experimentation, and in doing so also acquired something called a magic madness and sadness, the condition that afflicts all magic users in the Adventure Time universe to varying degrees. She went gradually, terribly crazy in her own right. She began to do things that she knew were wrong, driven by the obsessive logic of someone whose judgment has been compromised by both grief and magical corruption. She tried to reprogram the crown's circuits by uploading a digital version of herself into it, which temporarily made the Ice King act even more strangely than usual. She tried to steal the crown through intermediaries. She tried to use magical artifacts gathered from across Ooo to build something that would break the curse. She kidnapped Gunter at one point, demanded the crown in exchange because she would do literally anything, including criminal acts she knew were wrong. Because the alternative was failing Simon, and she had spent 1,000 years, subjectively in her heart, loving a person who no longer existed, and she was not going to stop now. At her lowest point, how she started planning to use the collected elemental gems to open a time portal, back before the Mushroom War, to go back and prevent Simon from ever finding the crown, to undo all of it. She did not fully account for what this would mean for everyone who had come to exist in Ooo in the 1,000 years since the Mushroom War. All the candy people and slime people and all the rest, all of them erased from existence if the timeline were changed. She had reached the point where her obsession with restoring Simon had taken precedence over everything else, including the lives of the people he had come to protect and care for in his own distorted way. The Ice King stopped her. The Ice King, who did not know Simon Petrikov, who did not understand the weight of what Betty was trying to do, but who was just a confused old man who felt vaguely protective of the kingdom and people he had come to regard as his own, stopped her from erasing Ooo. He told her that the things she wanted to sacrifice were not hers to sacrifice. He told her that the Candy Kingdom's people were real, and their existence mattered even if she could not see them clearly through her obsession. He was right. He was more right in that moment than he usually managed to be. There is something deeply moving about the Ice King being the one to stop Betty from doing the thing she was doing for his sake. As if Simon, locked somewhere inside the crown's influence, was still trying in whatever way he could to be the person he had been. To choose other people's well-being over his own interests, and to be the warm and decent man who had always showed up for the people who needed him. Betty tried to reach him in other ways. In Broke His Crown, Princess Bubblegum and Marceline entered the Ice King's crown virtually, a sequence that revealed that inside the crown's circuitry, stored as a kind of digital ghost, was a perfectly sane Simon Petrikov, preserved and aware and able to interact with people who managed to get past the crown's defenses. The AI version of Betty that had been uploaded there was able to be cured of her madness when she encountered this Simon, and remembered who she was and why she had come. But getting to the real Simon through the crown's influence was not a digital problem. It was a magical one. And it would take the end of the world, more or less, to solve it. Betty's name is an homage to Stanislav Grof, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, a detail the show includes, because Betty's story is, at its core, a psychological one about what happens when a person loses the anchor of their own identity to their devotion to someone else. "I spent so much time dedicated to Simon," Betty said, in one of her most lucid moments. "I'm not even sure there's any me left anymore." That is the tragedy underneath the tragedy. Simon lost himself to the crown. Betty lost herself to the mission of saving Simon. Two people who had been together something whole, and who were destroyed by their love for each other, not because the love was wrong, but because the circumstances allowed no good outcomes. The story of Betty Groff is a story about what happens when love becomes a fixed point instead of a living thing. Like when the person you love is no longer accessible to you, and rather than grieving and eventually releasing, you hold on harder and harder and harder until the holding on is all you are. She was not wrong to try to save him. She was not wrong to love him. She was not even wrong about the fact that there was something worth saving. But the obsession consumed her in its own way, as surely as the crown consumed him, until the two people who had once been happy together, in a world that still existed, were both completely lost. One to ice and madness, one to magic and grief. The show knows this. That is why it lets Betty's story be as complicated and as morally ambiguous as it is. Not a simple love story with a happy ending, and not a simple cautionary tale with a clear moral. Something messier and truer and more human than either of those. A love story that did not know how to end until the very last possible moment. Section 9. The Ice Kingdom Princesses and the Ghost of a Name. In the present-day land of Oo, the Ice King lives in a castle on a frozen mountain in what is called the Ice Kingdom, which is exactly what it sounds like. A territory of perpetual winter where the air is always sharp and the ground is always white and the penguins are everywhere. The castle itself has a face, windows arranged to suggest two eyes and a mouth, giving it the specific personality that the Ice King imprints on everything around him, the inability to leave things neutral, the unconscious drive to make everything personal. The penguins are Gunter, or rather, they are all called Gunter, or variations of Gunter. Gunter with a soft vowel, Gunther with an H. Gunth, Gunt. The crown has impressed this name onto the Ice King with the same permanence that it impressed everything else. The name that Evergreen shouted at his dinosaur apprentice. The name that became the crown's default word for anyone who served or accompanied its wearer. The penguins accept this with the equanimity of animals who have no expectation of being called by their correct names. One of them, the most prominent Gunter, is not actually a penguin at all, but we will come to that. The Ice King's days in the present-day land of Oo are largely organized around two activities. The first is kidnapping princesses. He does this constantly, and the show is mostly played for comedy, and it mostly is comedic. The kidnappings are absurdly incompetent. The princesses are largely inconvenienced rather than harmed. But Finn and Jake show up and defeat him with minimal effort. He goes back to his castle, and the cycle repeats. But underneath the comedy, we now understand what he is doing. He is looking for Betty. He does not know he is looking for Betty. He just knows that he needs a princess, that the word princess carries weight it cannot fully explain, that somewhere there is a right princess who will make everything make sense. His nickname for Betty was his princess. That is what the crown distorted. A private endearment between two people who loved each other, transformed by the loss of context into a compulsion directed at strangers. Every princess he kidnapped was an attempt to fill the specific shape of an absence he could no longer name. And every princess who was terrified of him and refused him and escaped, or was rescued, was another chapter in a 1,000-year search that was never going to find what it was looking for. Because what it was looking for was not a princess, but a person. And that person was alive in a different century. Princess Bubblegum, the primary target of his kidnapping attempts, was assessed by herself and others as not in real danger. The Ice King was the kind of threat that required maintenance rather than defeating in any final sense. Finn and Jake became experts at this maintenance, keeping him distracted, foiling the kidnappings, talking him down, or confusing him into giving up, managing the relationship with the patient exasperation you develop for someone who is going to be in your life forever, whether you enjoy it or not. Over time, a lot of the Ice King's interactions with Finn and Jake developed into something more complicated than simple hero-villain antagonism. He began to think of them as friends, in his own confused way. He sought out their company. He tried to collaborate with them on things. He was lonely in a way that was so complete and so deep that even adversarial interactions were preferable to the specific emptiness of his castle with only penguins for company. He wrote fan fiction. Specifically, he wrote extensive stories about gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake, Fiona and Cake, set in an adventure world similar to Ooh. He wrote these stories obsessively in the way that people sometimes fill the spaces of their inner life with creative work when they have no other way to process what they are feeling. So he gave readings of the stories to anyone who would listen, which was primarily his penguins. He was very proud of them. He was also, in a way he did not consciously understand, creating things he would later discover he had more reason to be proud of than he knew. He also had the past room in his castle, a room he kept locked, that he sometimes visited when the crown's influence was thinner than usual, or when something had stirred the buried sediment of his past enough to make him look for something he could not name. Inside the past room, his old suit from before the crown, his old glasses, the ones he found embarrassing when he saw himself wearing them on the tapes, his old research materials, a library of books and documents from his Simon Petrikov life. He had kept all of this without knowing exactly why, and had locked it away as the past with a directness that suggests some part of him recognized that it was dangerous, that looking too closely at these things might destabilize whatever equilibrium the crown had built. His relationship with Marceline was the most complicated and resonant relationship the Ice King had, even after the forgetting. He could not remember who she was. He did not know her as a person from his past. But he kept finding her. Every time she moved, he eventually turned up at her door. Not with any menace, not trying to kidnap her or do her harm, just present, in the way of someone following a pull they cannot explain. She found this annoying. She told him to stay away from her house. She moved multiple times specifically to get away from him. And every time he found her again, she understood why. She knew it was the echo of Simon, not any conscious memory or intention, but the specific gravity of a relationship that had been, for a few years in the ruins of the world, the most important thing either of them had. The crown had taken his memory, but not the pull. It had taken his ability to know why she mattered, but not the fact of her mattering. He kept finding her the way bodies keep returning to warmth, even when the mind has forgotten what warmth means. She let him in sometimes, when his visits aligned with what she needed. In I Remember You, she let him help her write a song. In Simon and Marcy, she invited him to play basketball and revealed to Finn and Jake the whole of their shared history. Not for his benefit, he could not receive it, but for the benefit of the people around her who needed to understand what they were looking at when they looked at the Ice King. There was a painful moment in I Remember You when she showed him the old photograph, the one from his past with the message on the back. She sang the words to him in Rebecca Sugar's extraordinary composition. I'm losing my mind, and I'm afraid you're going to lose me too. The Ice King did not understand what was happening. He thought it was a song they were writing together, thought it was a composition he had produced that needed her voice to complete it. He played drums while she sang his old words back to him. Words about a man disappearing, words about fear of the forgetting, words about a child in the wreckage and love that knew it was running out. And he cried a little at the end. Not because he remembered, just because the music was sad, and music sometimes does that to people, even when the specific reason for the sadness is no longer accessible to them. She cried too, much more than a little. She knew what the tears were for. He never would. What we can say about the Ice King in this long middle period of his existence is that he was not evil. He was not good either, not in any straightforward sense. The kidnapping was genuinely harmful to the princesses, genuinely frightening and traumatizing and wrong, whatever the underlying cause. But he was not malicious. He did not want to hurt anyone. He wanted company in the way of someone who has been alone for so long that the concept of company has become almost theological. the thing that would fix everything, us the thing that was being unjustly withheld, the solution to a problem he could feel but not name. He was also, in his better moments, capable of genuine heroism. He saved Marceline's life multiple times across the series, in moments where the instinct to protect her broke through everything else. He helped Finn and Jake on various occasions when the situation required it, and when his functioning was reliable enough for him to be useful. He was brave in the specific way of someone who had been doing dangerous things with a crown that was eating his mind for over 1,000 years and had run out of being afraid of physical danger a long time ago. He was, in short, a complicated person who deserved better than what he got, and who was doing his level best with what remained of himself after the crown had taken what it took. And the crown was not done yet. It was never done. Not until the very end. One specific thing worth understanding about the Ice King's present-day existence is the matter of Gunter, the penguin. The penguin most often seen at the Ice King's side, the one who featured in the video diaries, the one whose name was used so freely that it had lost any particular distinction from all the other Gunters. Gunter, it would eventually be revealed, was not a penguin. Gunter was Orgolorg, an ancient cosmic entity of enormous power who had been diminished and imprisoned in the form of a small flightless bird by the cosmic force Grob Gob Glob Grod, after causing trouble on a cosmic scale millions of years ago. Orgolorg had maneuvered themselves into the Ice King's company and had been waiting, across the millennia if necessary, for an opportunity to recover their power and resume whatever grand destructive agenda they had been pursuing before the imprisonment. This is one of those Adventure Time revelations that once you know it, makes retrospective sense. The Ice King named all his penguins Gunter because the crown's logic demanded it. But this particular Gunter, this specific entity who happened to be most often at the Ice King's side, had chosen to be there. Had arranged to be there. Had been studying the crown, observing the Ice King's power, waiting for the right moment. The crown does strange things to the people around it, as well as to the person wearing it. It has a gravity. It attracts. The Ice King, inadvertently in his lonely castle on his frozen mountain, had been harboring one of the more dangerous entities in the solar system for an unknown length of time, thinking of it as his penguin. This is somehow perfectly characteristic of his situation. Even his pets turned out to be something he had not bargained for. Section 10. Come along with me. The finale and the sacrifice. The finale of Adventure Time is called Come Along With Me, and it is the culmination of 10 seasons of a story that began with a goofy cartoon about a human boy and a magic dog having adventures, and became, over years and through the gradual accumulation of lore and tragedy and extraordinary character development, something much bigger and sadder and more beautiful than most people could have predicted from the early episodes for the Ice King. The finale is the end of one story and the beginning of another. For Simon Petrikov, it is the moment he has been, in some sense, waiting for, since 1,000 years ago, though he has not been able to consciously want it because the crown has not allowed that kind of wanting. The central conflict of the finale involves a being called Golb, a cosmic entity of chaos and disorder, essentially a force of primordial unmaking. Golb is attracted to magic. Golb, when it arrives in the land of U, begins to consume things, people, objects, magic itself, converting them through a process the show describes as digestion into their most essential original forms. Betty, by the time of the finale, has gone fully into her magic-corrupted obsession. She summons Golb deliberately, that having calculated that Golb's power is the only force available strong enough to do what she needs it to do. Strip the Ice King of the crown's magic, restore Simon, fix everything. She has convinced herself that this is possible. She has convinced herself that the collateral damage is acceptable, which is the specific delusion of someone who has let love become a justification for harm. The Gum War is happening simultaneously, a conflict between Princess Bubblegum and her uncle Gumbald that threatens to swallow the entire kingdom in blood. Golb's arrival derails this, as cosmic entities of chaos tend to derail things. And in the chaos, the Ice King, Betty, and Finn are all swallowed by Golb. Inside Golb. This is where the transformation finally, completely, and permanently reverses. Golby's digestion strips away everything that is not essential, not original, not the true core of the being consumed. For Finn, this means the prosthetic mechanical arm he had acquired is destroyed, returning him to his original physical state. For the Ice King, it means something much larger. The crown's magic is stripped away, consumed by Golb's process, and the person left behind without it is no longer the Ice King. Simon Petrikov opens his eyes. He is no longer the blue-skinned wizard with the pointy nose and the white beard, and the thousand-year-old obsession with princesses. He is just Aimonia, the 47-year-old archaeologist, the professor, the person who wore round glasses and had olive skin and was engaged to a woman named Betty and loved her very much. He is younger than he should be, yet in the same way that the episode Betty showed him reverting to his pre-crown physical state when the magic left. He is himself, and Betty is there with him in the same space. Both of them returned, at last, to the forms they had before the crown changed everything. They embrace each other. This is the reunion that has been 1,000 years in the making. Two people who were separated by a magical artifact purchased from an old dockworker in Scandinavia, separated by the Mushroom War and the long transformation, and the centuries of her loving him from across time while he did not know her name. Here they are together, in the stomach of a cosmic chaos entity, in the middle of the end of the world, holding each other. It does not last long enough. Golb's internal space is shrinking. Finn and Simon need to escape or they will be consumed completely, destroyed rather than simply stripped. And Betty makes a calculation that she has perhaps been making on some level for a very long time. She stays behind. She chooses to stay inside Golby while Finn and Simon escape. She uses the crown, which has been restored to its most essential form inside Golb's space. A pure, wish-granting artifact without the personality-erasing madness to try to wish Golb out of existence. It doesn't work. Golb is too fundamental, too basic, too much a part of the structure of existence to simply be wished away. So she changes the wish. She wishes that Simon will always be protected. The crown grants this wish by fusing Betty with Golb. The two become a single entity, Golb-Betty, something that is both and neither, and a cosmic being that carries Betty's intelligence and care inside Golb's enormous, formless power. Golb-Betty, thus changed, becomes less destructive than Golb alone had been. Betty's presence inside the entity is enough to redirect it, to give it something like purpose instead of just Ka. Golb-Betty leaves Oo through a dimensional portal, taking the threat with it. The war is averted. The land of Oo is saved. And Simon Petrikov stands in the wreckage of the battle, watching the new entity's face through the portal as it closes, recognizing Betty in its expression, understanding what she has done and what it cost. He cries out for her. She is gone. The crown, having been restored to its essential wish-granting form and then used by Betty, falls to the ground in the aftermath of her departure. Gunter, the penguin, at the former Orgelorg, picks it up and puts it on. The crown reacts to Gunter's deepest wish, which is, according to the show, to be like the Ice King, to be the beloved master it has followed for so many years. It does not turn Gunter back into Orgelorg. It transforms Gunter into something new, the Ice Thing, a penguin-shaped entity with ice powers and a different relationship with the crown than Simon ever had, since Gunter bonded with it willingly and with a wish that was, in its own way, a kind of love rather than a kind of grief. Simon, watching all of this, is comforted by Marceline. She holds him. She is the only person in Oo who has known him for 1,000 years, the only person in Oo who can fully understand the weight of this moment for him, the freedom and the loss simultaneously, had the return of himself at the cost of the person he most wanted to come back to. He is Simon again. He is free. He is also, in the most fundamental sense, alone in a way he was not entirely alone before. The crown's influence was terrible, but it was also company of a kind, a constant presence inside his own head. Without it, he is simply a man from a world that ended 1,000 years ago, standing in a land that has grown up in the ruins of that world, with no powers and no magic and no home in any of the senses he once knew the word. Marceline holds him. She does not say that everything is fine. She knows better than that. She just holds him. The show's future scenes, glimpsed in the many years later sequence of the finale, give us a brief and bittersweet picture of Simon in the aftermath. Living with Marceline and Princess Bubblegum and the ice thing, making popcorn, existing quietly in the company of people who know him. Not the Ice King, not Simon before the crown. Just Simon now, in whatever form that takes in a world that has moved on from everything he used to be part of. He is alive. He is himself. That is not nothing. It is not enough either. Betty is gone. And Simon has to figure out who he is when the thing that defined him for 1,000 years is no longer there. Section 11. Simon. After the crown. Fiona, Cake, and Learning to Live. 12 years after the events of the Adventure Time finale, Simon Petrikov is depressed. This is the starting point of Adventure Time, Fiona and Cake, the spin-off series that premiered in 2023 and gave the Simon half of the Ice King story the full and honest ending it deserved. 12 years is a long time, long enough that the immediate trauma of the finale has settled into something chronic. Not the sharp pain of recent loss, but the dull ache of a life that does not fit. Long enough that Simon has tried various things and found that none of them are quite working. He runs a small exhibit on Human Island, Ois, one of the remnant communities of humans in U, describing what life was like in the 20th century. He watches Cheers reruns, the same show he used to sing to young Marceline in the ruins of the world. He has gotten older in a way that he could not get older before, which is both proof of his restoration and a constant reminder of how much time has passed and how much he has lost. He is in his early 60s now, at the very least. Age catching up with a body that spent 1,000 years suspended, then was returned to normal and told to resume aging. The world of U does not quite know what to do with him. To the candy people and the various other beings of the land of U, Simon Petrikov is primarily interesting as the former Ice King. The same way a retired rock star is interesting, mostly because of who they used to be, rather than who they are now. They know about Fiona and Cake, the stories the Ice King wrote in his long centuries of magical madness. They love those stories. They want to talk about those stories. Now, they do not particularly want to talk to Simon about what it is like to be a 60-something human in a world of candy. People who does not have magic anymore and cannot fully connect to anyone around him. He almost misses being the Ice King. He says this, eventually, to Finn. Admits that at least as the Ice King, he was not depressed. The Ice King did not have the capacity for this specific kind of depression, because the Ice King was not aware enough of the gap between what he had and what he had lost to feel the loss as depression. He was simply operating. Now Simon is aware of everything he lost, aware of the world Betty gave up her existence to give him, aware that he is a temporal fish out of water in a way that no one around him can fully understand, and the weight of all that awareness is enormous. That he attempts a ritual to summon Betty, or Goal Betty, the entity she became, because he is not ready to let go. Because he has always, underneath everything, been someone who holds on. He cannot quite accept that her sacrifice, which was for him, also means she is gone. The ritual fails, or rather it succeeds in the wrong direction. Instead of summoning Goal Betty, he accidentally opens a portal into the Fiona and Cake universe. The alternate reality that, it turns out, was not simply the product of the Ice King's fanfiction imagination, but an actual universe that Prismo had created out of his own loneliness, and hidden inside the Ice King's mind, powered by the residual magic of the crown. Fiona and Cake fall through the portal into his living room, and with them comes the Scarab, a cosmic auditor, an agent of the divine bureaucracy that manages the multiverse, whose job is to find illegal universes and destroy them. Fiona and Cake's universe was created without authorization. The Scarab has come to erase it. And Simon, who is responsible for accidentally releasing them into the main timeline, is now responsible for keeping them alive. The quest across the multiverse that follows in the Fiona and Cake series is, on its surface, a search for another ice crown. A version of the crown from one of the alternate timelines that could restore magic to Fiona's world and allow it to continue existing without needing to be hidden inside Simon's mind. But it is, on a deeper level, Simon's journey toward a decision about who he is and what he is willing to become. But the multiverse they traverse is full of versions of Simon, alternate timelines in which the Ice King story went differently. The Winter King, who found a way to remove the crown's curse by transferring it to Princess Bubblegum, creating a version of events where Simon survived at the cost of someone else suffering what he once suffered. A dark mirror of what Betty did, but without Betty's love to make it anything other than a selfish act. A vampire world Simon who died before ever meeting Marceline, producing an alternate Marceline who, without his influence, became something genuinely frightening rather than the person she is in the main timeline. An extinct world Simon who had outlived everything, alone in a universe where humanity had ended, still holding on. These alternate Simons are, collectively, one of the series' ways of helping the real Simon understand the specific value of the particular path his life took, with all its horror and all its loss. The vampire world Marceline, when Simon encountered her, helped him see something he had been carrying as pure regret. That by wandering into her life as a half-mad ice wizard, he had not damaged her. He had shaped her, not in a perfect way, not without cost, but in a way that was genuinely formative for who she became. She would have been worse off without him. The trauma he feared he had caused was inseparable from the foundation he had provided. In the extinct world, after finding the crown and preparing to put it on and become the Ice King again, Simon had the breakthrough the entire series had been building toward. He thought about Betty, yet he thought about everything she gave up. He thought about the pattern of their relationship, her always sacrificing, him always receiving, and the particular cruelty of him choosing to reach for the crown again, as if her sacrifice had not happened. As if he were still just the person looking for a solution, rather than the person whose solution had already been provided at a cost he had not yet fully reckoned with. He threw the crown away. He chose to go back to his world, to the world where he was just Simon, older and without magic and uncertain of his place, the world Betty had bought him with her existence, and figure out how to live in it, not because everything was fine, not because the grief was gone, but because the grief and the loss and the difficulty were the true cost of the life she had given him, and refusing to live it fully would be a second act of not valuing what she had valued enough to die for. Gol Betty appeared in the final moments of the Fiona and Cake first season. She appeared to Simon and she let him see her, the being she had become, something immensely powerful and no longer quite human, but still recognizably carrying something of Betty inside it, the way ancient stars still carry in their light the moment of their formation. She told him she did not regret anything, that she had not regretted her choices, that she loved him and she had spent her existence in ways that felt, to her, like the right ones. And Simon told her that he was sorry, not in the collapsed, despairing way of someone asking forgiveness they feel they do not deserve, but in the clear-eyed way of someone who has finally understood what they received and what it cost the giver and wants the giver to know that they understand. He was sorry he had not always seen what she was doing for him. Sorry he had let the pattern continue without recognizing it sooner. Sorry the love between them had been so unequal in its direction for so long, without him being aware enough to do anything differently. She forgave him. She implied, already forgiven him. She also gently got back on the cosmic bus that was waiting for her. She had places to be as a being of chaos and love and the particular power of someone who had made the largest possible choice freely and without regret. She was Gol Betty now. She was something new. Simon watched her go. This time he did not cry out after her. This time, how he let her go. He went back to Ooh. He started therapy. He began to find his way toward the life that was waiting for him, the mundane, unmagical, difficult, and precious life of a very old human in a world full of candy people who had survived something extraordinary and was now tasked with the less dramatic but no less important work of living in its aftermath. The Fiona and Cake universe was officially canonized by Gol Betty's action in the finale, transformed from an unauthorized, illegal reality hidden in a dead wizard's mind to a fully authorized world, genuine and recognized and permanent. The last magical residue of the Ice King's 1,000-year reign became something real and lasting, which feels like exactly the right note for that particular story to end on. The Ice King's delusions and his madness and his decades of writing lonely fanfiction in a frozen castle were, In the end, an act of unconscious creation that produced something that deserved to exist. The crown took so much from him, but even in the taking, it left him this: a universe born from his imagination that the multiverse deemed worth keeping. Fiona and Cake continued their adventures in a world that now had magic again. Simon continued his quieter adventure in a world that was learning to be his home. Marceline was there. She would always be there, in the specific way that she had always been there. The constant, the one person in all of Ooh who had known him longest and best, but who carried the full weight of his history with more grace than anyone could have expected of a 1,000-year-old half-demon vampire with her own enormous pile of things to carry. He was Simon Petrikov. He was 60-something years old and had been alive for over 1,000. He had been the Ice King once, for a very long time, and had done things he would not have done if he had been himself, and had also in a strange way been the best version of what he could be even in that state. Protected a child, kept her safe, found her a stuffed bear in a ruined toy store, written stories about a world where people had adventures. He had loved Betty Groff and lost her, and been found by her again and lost her again in a way that was somehow both more final and more bearable than the first time. That because this time he knew it was a choice she made freely, and with full knowledge of what she was choosing. He was not the Ice King anymore. He was just Simon. Just Simon. That was enough. Finally, after everything, that was enough. A final thought. The story of the Ice King is, at its core, a story about what gets lost and what stays. Simon Petrikov lost his memory, his identity, his fiancée, his world. The crown took almost everything. It left him the shell of a life, ice powers and loneliness, and a castle and a vague, aching pull toward a word he could no longer decode. It left him 1,000 years of being a person he would not have wanted to be, doing things he would not have wanted to do, in a world that found him alternately funny and annoying and sad. But here is what the crown could not take. It could not take the pull toward Marceline, could not fully sever the bond between a man who had carried her through the ruins of a world and a girl who had waited for him to come back even when she knew he wouldn't. It could not take the warmth that leaked through in the Ice King's better moments, the kindness that showed up when the crown's noise was quiet enough to let it through. It could not take the creativity, the music, the stories, the specific imaginative richness of a man who had spent his life thinking carefully about the past and could not stop making things even when he did not know why he was making them. It could not take the love exactly, it could only redirect it, could only twist it into the kidnapping and the desperate princess searching. But underneath the twist, the love was always there, still reaching, and still trying to find what it had lost, in whatever form the crown would allow it to take. And it could not take the meaning that Simon's existence, even in its most compromised form, had for the people around him. He shaped Marceline. He gave Betty a cause that, however it consumed her, also gave her the most extraordinary adventure of her life. He gave Finn and Jake a first major villain who turned out to be something they were not prepared for, who taught them that the world was more complicated than it looked. He wrote Fiona and Cake. He endured. That is the heart of it. After 65 million years, the crown was trying to do the same thing it had always done, trying to turn the person who wore it into a frantic, ice-blasting echo of a prehistoric dinosaur's deepest wish. And Simon endured. Not without enormous loss, and not without profound transformation, not without cost. But the person underneath, the Simon that the crown was trying to erase, was never fully erased. He was preserved, in the crown's own circuitry, in the memories of the people who loved him, in the stories his corrupted mind produced. In the pull toward a woman named Betty that the crown could redirect but never fully kill. He survived 1,000 years of being eaten alive from the inside by the thing on his head. He survived it, and he came back, and he started therapy. That is not nothing. That is actually everything. If this story settled something in you, brought you comfort, or kept you company in the dark hours when you needed someone telling a slow and careful story, leave a comment below. Tell us what time it is where you are and what you're watching from. And it genuinely matters to know you're out there. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It keeps the lights on and keeps the stories coming, and there are so many more stories to tell. Like the video if it helped you sleep. Share it with someone who loves Adventure Time as much as we do. Stay warm. And remember that somewhere in a version of the world worth imagining, Simon Petrikov is watching Cheers reruns and eating popcorn with his friends, and the crown is someone else's problem now. Good night. Additional deep dive: the mechanics of memory, the meaning of madness, and why the Ice King's story still matters. There is a reason this story has stayed with people the way it has, and a reason that the episodes centered on Simon Petrikov's past, Holly Jolly Secrets, I Remember You, Simon and Marcy, Betty, Broke His Crown, and eventually the Fiona and Cake series, are consistently ranked among the finest episodes of a show that was excellent across 10 seasons and 3 spin-offs. It is not simply that the story is sad, though it is extraordinarily sad. It is that the story is true in a way that goes beyond its fantasy context, in a way that speaks to experiences that real people actually have, and that animation is uniquely positioned to hold with care. The show's writers and the critics who later examined their work made the comparison explicit. The Ice King's condition, the progressive loss of self to something external that takes your memories and replaces them with its own imperatives. That is a painfully precise analog to Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. Novelist Lev Grossman, speaking in an NPR interview, put it plainly and with personal weight. My dad has been going through having Alzheimer's, and he's forgotten so much about who he used to be. And I look at him and think this cartoon is about my father dying. That is the kind of thing that does not happen when a story is just well crafted. That is what happens when a story is genuinely true. When it has found a way to say something about human experience that the people experiencing that thing cannot always find the language for, and has said it in a form that makes the recognition feel like company rather than intrusion. Simon Petrikov knew he was losing his mind, and he documented it on tape because he understood that the documentation would outlast the knowledge. He wrote a note to a child because he understood that the child would remember what he was about to forget. He stayed as long as he could because he understood that his presence was worth something, and his absence was going to hurt someone. And he wanted to delay that hurt as long as his remaining clarity allowed. People who watch their parents or grandparents or loved ones slip away to dementia recognize this. Recognize the specific horror of the person who knows, who has moments of devastating clarity in which they understand exactly what is happening, and then loses that knowledge, and then recovers it briefly, and then loses it again. The notes left for people who will no longer be able to read them. The preparations made for an absence the person cannot prevent. The love that continues beyond the knowledge of who it is for. The show does not use the word dementia. It does not have to. The emotional architecture is exactly right, and people who know it recognize it immediately and without requiring it to be labeled. There is also something specifically powerful about the way the show handles the question of who Simon becomes under the crown. He is not a monster. He is not a villain in any serious sense. He is someone whose capacity for judgment, for context, for understanding the relationship between his desires and the rights of others has been severely compromised by an external force. The Ice King does bad things. He does them repeatedly and with conviction. But he does them without malice. Without any real understanding of their impact, in the confused way of someone whose moral reasoning has been scrambled, rather than whose moral core has been corrupted. This is a precise and compassionate depiction of something real. The way external forces, disease, trauma, addiction, prolonged abuse, can produce behavior in people that we would, if we encountered it in a vacuum, describe as wrong, while the person producing it is not wrong in any deep sense, is in fact still someone whose original character was fundamentally decent and who deserves both accountability for the behavior and recognition of the forces that produced it. Adventure Time never used the Ice King to excuse his behavior. The kidnappings were harmful. The harassment of Marceline was harmful. The various destructions of property and peace were harmful. But the show did not suggest these things were fine because of Simon's history. What it suggested was that understanding someone's history changes how you see them and how you might respond to them, not by abandoning standards, but by expanding compassion. Finn and Jake, after learning Simon's story, did not stop stopping him. They kept stopping the kidnappings, kept intervening, kept doing what needed to be done. But they stopped hating him. They could not sustain the hatred once they understood the weight behind it. That is the show's argument. You can hold someone accountable and also hold them with care. You can recognize harm and also recognize the harm done to the person causing it. These are not mutually exclusive positions. There is also the deeper question of identity that the Ice King story raises, and that the Fiona and Cake series finally has the time to explore properly. What does it mean to be a self? If the crown took Simon Petrikov's memories, his personality, his sense of who he was, and replaced them with the Ice King, was the Ice King a different person or a different version of the same person? Is identity determined by memory and personality so that the loss of both constitutes the loss of the self? Or is there something underneath memory and personality that persists that is the self in a more fundamental sense? Adventure Time is not entirely sure and is honest about not being entirely sure. The show at various points treats the Ice King as essentially a different person from Simon, as someone who needs to be distinguished from him, whose choices and actions belong to him rather than to the Simon underneath. But the show also simultaneously treats them as the same person. The Ice King who keeps finding Marceline is still Simon finding Marceline, in some unextinguished part of himself. The Ice King who kept the past room, who could not bring himself to destroy the glasses and the old suit, was still Simon protecting something. The magical preservation of Simon's consciousness inside the crown's circuitry, revealed in Broke His Crown, is the show's most explicit answer to the question, though it raises as many complications as it resolves. Inside the crown, there is a version of Simon who is entirely himself, entirely sane, entirely aware of what has been done to him. He exists in there the way a hostage exists in a room, present, intact, unable to leave. He can communicate under the right circumstances, with people who find a way into that space. He is there. The question of whether this means Simon and the Ice King coexisted for 1,000 years. Two beings occupying the same body, one imprisoned inside the other's jewelry, is genuinely disturbing, and the show allows it to be genuinely disturbing. The Ice King, fully in control of the body, going about his life of kidnapping and penguin dance parties, while somewhere inside his crown, Simon Petrikov sat alone in whatever the interior of magical circuitry looks like and watched, unable to stop any of it, unable to reach out to anyone he had loved. Just there, aware, waiting. 12 years after the finale, when Simon is living in Ooh and going to therapy and making popcorn with his friends, this is part of what he is processing. Not just the grief of Betty's loss, but not just the disorientation of being a 20th century human in a 1,000-year-old future, also the specific, strange experience of having been inside the crown for a millennium, of being the prisoner of a magical artifact in a way that no one around him has any reference point for. He has no one to compare notes with. He has no support group for people who spent 1,000 years imprisoned inside their own enchanted headwear while a corrupted alter ego ran their body. He has a therapist, apparently. The show mentions this. It is one of the small, practical, genuinely moving details of the Fiona and Cake series that Simon is in therapy. That the show takes seriously the idea that what happened to him would require that kind of professional support to process, rather than treating his recovery as a simple restoration of function. But he was not just cured and fine, he is working on it. That is, in its own way, one of the most honest things the show does. It acknowledges that some experiences cannot simply be resolved by removing the source of the problem. The crown is gone. Simon is himself. But the 1,000 years is not gone. The trauma is not gone. Betty is not gone in any sense except the physical one. And even in the physical sense, she is not so much gone as transformed, as elsewhere, as something that continues to exist in a form he cannot reach. He carries all of this, and he has to figure out how to live with what he carries. The fact that he chooses to do this, chooses therapy, chooses the difficult work of sitting with the weight of his own history, chooses not to reach for the crown or any other magical shortcut, is the quiet heroism of his post-finale story. It is less dramatic than stopping the Mushroom War or surviving the apocalypse or protecting a child from mutants in a ruined landscape. But it is, in its way, a harder thing, because he is doing it without the crown to buffer the pain, without magical powers to impose his will on difficult situations, without the particular numbness that came with being the Ice King and not knowing what had been lost. He is doing it as a human being, with a human being's vulnerability and a human being's capacity for change in a world that is strange to him, but that contains people who care about him. Marceline cares about him. This bears examination because it is one of the series' genuinely extraordinary emotional through lines. Marceline, the vampire queen, who is, by the time of the main series, over 1,000 years old, who has been through enormous amounts of her own trauma and loss and complicated history, has carried her love for Simon across all of that time. She was 4 or 5 years old when he found her. She is genuinely ancient by the time we meet her in the present, and she still loves him. She has always loved him. Not romantically. The show is clear about this, and Marceline herself is clear when it matters, stopping him when his confused attempts at affection misread their relationship. She loves him the way children love the adults who took care of them in their most vulnerable moments, the love that becomes the foundation of a person's capacity to trust and be cared for. He gave her that foundation. In the wreckage of the world, like when her own father was absent and the world had ended and she had nothing, he showed up. He kept her warm and kept her fed and kept her laughing and gave her hambo and sang her a song about a bar where everybody knows your name. And he did all of this while his own mind was being systematically dismantled by something he could not remove. That is what she carried for 1,000 years, the knowledge of what he had been. The grief of watching him not know her. The determination to be nearby, despite his inability to recognize why, because she could not fully let go of the person who had held her together when there was nothing left to hold. Their relationship, across the whole of both series, is the show's most sustained meditation on what love looks like after loss, on how you hold someone in your heart when they are no longer able to hold you back, on how you maintain a relationship with someone who does not know they are in one with you, on how you forgive in advance as Simon asked her to forgive him for things that have not yet happened, simply because you love the person and you understand that the harm will not be coming from them, but from something that has been done to them. She forgave him. She has always forgiven him. And when he came back, when the Simon she had known was there again, she was there too. That is 1,000 years of constancy. That is loyalty at a scale most of us will never be asked to produce. That is what the show wants to say about love, that it can survive the longest and most complete kind of absence, and that the person who survives that kind of love, who carries it without it crushing them, is as extraordinary as the person they are carrying it for. The Crown also forced a reckoning with the question of how we understand history's villains. The Ice King was presented in the early seasons as a villain. He was the first recurring antagonist, the person Finn and Jake fought most regularly, the embodiment of the kind of magical evil that a boy hero is supposed to defeat. The revelation of his backstory did not make him a hero. It made him something more uncomfortable than either hero or villain, a person whose harmful actions were the direct result of something done to him, who could not be held fully morally responsible for a life he was not in control of, and who could also not simply be absolved of the harm caused in the course of that life. Adventure Time made this reckoning gradually and without announcing it. It did not flip a switch from villain to tragic figure. It added context layer by layer, episode by episode, until the picture was complex enough that simple categorization became impossible. That is how stories about real people work. Real people are almost never simply evil, and the ones we categorize as evil in early encounters almost always turn out, on closer examination, to have histories that produce them, and that neither explain away nor fully excuse what they became. The Ice King is not a metaphor for real evil. He is something more specific and more useful than a metaphor. An illustration of how the categories of good and evil can fail us when confronted with the complexity of what actually happens to people. That he is a lesson in the difference between understanding and excusing, between compassion and endorsement, between seeing the full picture and pretending the full picture erases the harm done in the foreground. Finn learned this lesson. Jake learned it. Princess Bubblegum eventually learned it. The audience, if the show did its job, and it did its job, learned it too. The Ice King's story is not a happy story. It does not end happily, not in any uncomplicated sense. Simon Petrikov is alive and himself, which is more than could have been hoped for at many points in the story. But Betty is gone in the way that only people who have made the largest possible choice are gone. Not lost, not dead in the ordinary sense, but absent in a way that does not easily resolve into either grief or relief. She is somewhere. She is something. She is not here. He wakes up every morning in a world that ended 1,000 years ago and has rebuilt itself in ways he does not always recognize. He makes popcorn. He watches Cheers. He misses her. He is alive and himself, and he is still here. And he is learning to value that even on the days when it is very hard. That is not a happy ending. It is a real one. Those are sometimes better. The full story of Simon Petrikov, from the antiquarian with round glasses who reached for the same book as the smartest woman he had ever met, through the Mushroom War and Marceline and the 1,000 Years of Forgetting, through Betty's return and sacrifice and the GOLB that swallowed and returned him, through the depression and the therapy and the multiverse and the final goodbye, is one of the longest, most carefully constructed, most emotionally honest character arcs in the history of animation. It is a story about how long love can last, about what survives the worst things that can happen to a person, about how we take care of each other in catastrophic circumstances, and how those acts of care echo across enormous stretches of time, changing the shape of everything that comes after, about how we carry the people we have loved when they are no longer able to be carried by themselves, about how we come back to ourselves, even after 1,000 years, even after everything, about how sometimes the most heroic thing is not the ice magic, or the apocalypse survival, or the fighting of cosmic entities. Sometimes it is the simple, daily, profoundly difficult act of continuing to be here and trying and making popcorn and showing up for therapy. About how the smallest gesture, a pink stuffed bear pulled from the rubble of a destroyed toy store, offered to a crying child in the wreckage of the world, can be the largest possible act of love. Simon Petrikov gave Marceline a stuffed bear to make her stop crying. She carried that bear for 1,000 years. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep well.